It's round 5 of the U.S. Chess Championship, and we just saw an absolutely incredible game played between Awonder Liang and Levon Aronian. And in the interview that followed after the game, Awonder actually said that he was inspired by one of his professors to play a relatively dubious gambit. So it was kind of cool to see. It's Awonder going up against a super grandmaster, and he kind of decided, you know what, my professor kind of inspired me to take a look at some of these dubious lines, and whatever. I'm playing a 2750 rated super GM. Like, what does it matter? I'm going to have a little bit of fun. I'm going to play something wild. And it worked like a charm. It was actually an amazing game. And the other thing that I know about Awonder is that he's actually a fan of the Jonathan Schrantz YouTube channel. So hi, Awonder! Everybody say hi to Awonder in the comments below. You did an excellent job. Congratulations on your major win. And let's just check this out because it was a really cool game. It was an e4, e5 opening, and it became the Scotch game, which became the Scotch Gambit. So here, white is actually not going to be recapturing the pawn right away. And Levon decides to play bishop to c5. This is one of the most solid approaches for black, just holding on to the pawn at d4 and then hoping to get everything else developed and castled. And usually white here plays the move pawn to c3. This is usually how this gambit continues, but instead we see this rare move, knight to g5, and this is known as the Schrantz variation. And it's not very common, even at like any level, but especially at this level of elite tournament, you're not very likely to run into this move. And in a way, it kind of looks like a Patzer move. You're moving your knight twice, you're just kind of making this easy, simple attack, a very caveman style against the f7 pawn. But as we'll see, this actually might be a very dangerous weapon for white to consider, because now black plays knight to h6, defending the pawn. But here there's a little bit of a tactic, and all of this is theory, but there is a way to exploit the position of the bishop on c5, and you do it with this move. Knight takes f7, sacrificing a piece temporarily, but after black takes back, you take the knight, and when the king takes back, you give this check, and this is how white will win the bishop back. So after g6, we saw white winning the bishop, and for now, the material is equal, but as we will see after the move pawn to d5, it becomes very difficult for white to try to maintain the pawn, and white should castle or play pawn to c3, as it happened in the game, because if you get a little bit greedy here with white, you might get in a little bit of trouble. Like, you should never allow this rook to enter into the game. Something like this is already going to be very disastrous for white, and you shouldn't do it with this queen trade. Not only do we not really want to trade queens with white, but something like this would not only allow the rook to come in, but it also might give black some knight b4 opportunities. So white is probably not going to be able to regain the pawn directly, and so instead, Awonder plays c3, allows black to capture on e4, and just decides to get castled. And this is it. White is a pawn down in this position, but it's the very apparent thing is the king safety for the black king. And if white, for example, is ever able to find an excellent diagonal for this bishop, this is what we're going to kind of see in the game, black could easily get himself into a lot of trouble and could end up getting checkmated early on in the game. Now, here we saw rook to e8, and the last thing that I should mention from the interview is that Awonder gave a little bit of analysis in this line, queen to d6, which is the preferred line of the computer. This is what's most played in the Masters database, even though there's only about 3 or 4 games played from this position, but it allows this one little trick for white that maybe is worth knowing, that you can get to this endgame, swap the queens off, take right here, allow all of this, play knight to c3, and you have a one small little trick, and that if black plays bishop to f5, which is probably a very logical move, you just want to defend that pawn, well, then you would be allowing bishop to h6, followed by rook to d1 and f3, and something like this is actually very promising for white. So that's a little bit of what might potentially happen, but instead, Levon comes up with this move, rook to e8. So here white decided to take, the queen takes back, and now white definitely is best advised to keep the queens on the board and plays queen to g5. And this is actually a game that has been played one time in the Masters database, and in that game, the queen actually went back to f6. This is kind of like the safest and most secure way for black to continue. You go back, you definitely hope for a queen trade, and in that game, we saw white keeping the queens on the board, and something like this eventually ended up in a draw. But Levon tries something a little bit trickier. After queen to g5, Levon tries knight to b4, and all of a sudden, black is potentially entering into some of these light squares. We don't know exactly yet where the knight is going, but all of a sudden, this is where potentially There's a very, very strong move for white, and this is where things are already starting to get a little bit dangerous for black, and I'm not sure exactly what Levon expected to see here, but bishop to d2 comes on the board, and all of a sudden, white is making the massive threat of putting this bishop on c3. Like, for example, if you decided to go win this rook, like, okay, whatever, I'm just going to go take your rook like nothing's happening, bishop to c3 comes, and all of a sudden, there's some major issues going on the dark squares. Like, I don't know where this queen would even go, but at some point, somehow we're going to be sneaking in, and this could be absolutely disastrous. Like, if you take this, we're just crashing through, and I don't know if you'd actually want to do this. Knight a3 defends the square, wins the knight. Something like this is absolutely horrible. It's something that could get black in a lot of early trouble. So Levon's here. He's got this big position. Computer says like king g8 and maybe black survives somehow, but Levon, sensing that bishop to c3 is coming, plays this move, queen to d6, but this already is the losing move, and we're on move 14, and already white just has a monstrously winning position, and queen d6 is, okay, obviously he's sensing that bishop is coming to c3, but it also makes you a little bit more susceptible to future attacks on the d file, and it's just a little bit slow, and as we're going to see, white now has an excellent way. He plays a very accurate move here, and for the rest of the game, Awonder actually plays a series of very accurate moves that just demonstrates the initiative that white is able to get from this position. And there's a lot of moves that I think here people might consider, but knight to c3 actually is a very, very powerful move, and it's a little bit surprising just how good it actually is. But this move not only kind of begins to keep an eye on this e4 pawn, like maybe in the future that's something that we'll be able to target, but you're also making the direct threat of knight to b5. Like, for example, if black were to just hop back with the king, all of a sudden knight to b5 would be coming. So black got this knight out, and he did it with by making a direct threat, because the problem is the queen needs to keep an eye on the knight, which is temporarily attacked by the bishop, but you also need to keep an eye on this pawn, and it's not so easy to go anywhere because you can't go to this square because we're able to swap these guys off and then win this knight. So it looks like there's just no real way for black to handle this, and that means black is going to need to invest even more time in a move like pawn to c6. So this is exactly what Levon does, and now white has a variety of very strong moves. You can bring this rook into over here, you can start playing with f3, or you can even play rook to d1, just lining up with the opponent's queen, and something like this looks very powerful and very strong for white, because now somehow black is going to need to eventually waste more time securing the queen. Well, here, Levon leaves the queen in the firing line and plays bishop to f5. And now Awonder says, okay, you're trying to protect your pawn? Nah, get gone. And he plays pawn to g4, forcing this bishop to go back. And it's not really easy for the bishop to go back anywhere. So first we see h6. He's trying to remove the defender of the pawn. Obviously, this is not a trade white wants, sorry. So white goes back to h4, keeping an eye on this pawn, the g pawn, so that now this bishop needs to go somewhere, and then he just simply takes on h6, and in this way white is able to get the pawn back. He's now attacking the queen, and he's really breaking through the defense of black, and it should be impossible for black to save the game at this point. Now the knight comes into d3. Bishop comes back to g5, and in this way white is getting ready to enter. It also prevents this rook from coming over and pinning, so all in all this seems to be a very sensible way of continuing. Queen goes to e5, getting out of the pin, also potentially being able to come back if needed for defense, but now f3. And in this way, white is making sure that he's going to be able to open the f-file in order to get more avenues of attack against the king. And he's also just undermining the knight that you see on d3. Well, now comes rook to h8, attacking the queen. We take here with check, king goes back, and now bishop to h6, blocking the check. And in this way, the queen will also be able to slowly infiltrate into the position. We've also set up threats such as rook to f8. In some positions, maybe the queen can also be swinging in, making all sorts of nasty threats. The biggest, of course, being rook to f8 coming in. So black gives a check, white jumps out of the way, and now bishop to e6. This defends against the threat because now the rook is able to swing on over and help, but now the queen does the creep. Queen to g5. She's just sneaking in, attacking this pawn. And now things get really wild after bishop to f7, because it looks for just a moment like maybe black is able to hold on and just kind of hang on to this position for just a moment. But now we see white eliminate one of the defenders, and this is why this is kind of an immortal game. We're going to see a lot of amazing sacrifices, and they're all sound, and they're all actually very well-played moves. And boom! Which starts with rook takes f7, removing one of these defenders. And the point is that if you do take this back, white is going to be sneaking in with yet another rook, and it's incredibly dangerous for the king to begin moving around. And even if a move like knight to f2 comes on the board, king to g2 is what's going to be played, and all of a sudden you're just in horrible shape. At some point black will almost always be forced to sacrifice and exchange, which is why after rook takes f7, rook takes h6. We see this very complicated series of moves, but then guess what white played? Obviously, you maybe can take here right away. You can do something like that, but white finds the mega super powerful rook takes d3. White is just sacrificing like literally everything. So he sacks this guy. This rook sacks. 3 exchange sacks in a row. And all of a sudden, black is in very poor shape, because after this recapture, we'll get to see why this is so strong. White is not interested in actually taking this back, but instead sneaking in and trying to get onto the g7 square. And it becomes this very powerless situation where the rook is needed to defend this square, but you also somehow need to defend this square, and there's no checks on the back rank. The knight is defending this, knight is defending this, queen is defending this square. So black is really in poor shape, and what are you meant to do? Well, he has to come up with something. There's no checks, and he's not able to defend the square, so he sacrifices a rook, and maybe you can hope that there's some sort of perpetual here, but after the check, he's actually able to just escape, and black keeps giving checks. And eventually, if these checks continue, like if we just keep giving checks, at some point, the king is going to be able to run to relative safety and get defended by these major pieces. So instead, at this moment, we see black go back. This is a way to defend this pawn and also the g7 square. But now g5, and this was actually the last move of the game, because all of a sudden, the queen can no longer defend both of these squares. If the queen moves literally anywhere, you're going to end up with this. And again, if we just start giving random checks with the queen, this time the king can run. And I think you can actually do this any way you want. It's worth pointing out that in some line, if we ever get to here, you can't even play this move, really, as black, because we're going to be able to take something like this, but you also can just run away. You don't have to give up your own rook. You can just run away, and eventually the white king will find safety on the other side of the board. So that's how Awonder Liang won this absolute masterclass of a game, a truly amazing Scotch Gambit. Sacked the pawn, took advantage of one inaccuracy in this very position, and after that played an absolutely amazing, thrilling, model attacking game. Multiple exchange sacrifices, crashed through, got the attack, and won the game. So if you like that, please make sure to subscribe. Good job, Awonder. Woohoo!